Hi, Peter Charles here, Hooked for Life Fly Fishing. And let's talk today about improving our spey casting by doing something a little unusual. And I'm specifically talking about spey casting with two-handed rods, not single-handers. I had a client out yesterday. We've worked together before, we've known each other, we fished together. And he wanted to get more into overhead casting. And so for the first time in a long time, I've had the opportunity to work with a client in overhead casting a two-hander. And something I've always believed in, but it's hard to convince people, is that you can become a much better two-handed spey caster if you learn to overhead cast with a spey rod. And the reason for this is a lot of our problems in spey casting haven't anything to do with the actual spey cast. Rather, the problems are in our ability to keep the rod tracking straight when we're making our forward cast and our back cast, whether it's an overhead or a D-loop, it doesn't matter. Our overhead cast doesn't track correctly, and our forward cast doesn't track correctly. And when we're trying to do a spey cast with all the curving motions that's involved in the spey cast, there's a tendency to get the rod behind us, to have the rod travel in a curving path, an arc in the forward stroke and in the back stroke, and also arcing in the vertical plane as well. So as a consequence, we end up with these ugly looking casts that don't go very far. The rod doesn't load properly, the line does not roll out straight, we get all these curves and bends in the line, and often the line hits the water fairly early and you've got this huge loop. Lots of problems. And the reality is, the first thing we should learn when we pick up a two-hander for the first time isn't a spey cast. We should learn to overhead cast perfectly first. Be able to false cast properly with a two-hander. If you can false cast with a two-hander and you can track dead straight, front and back, both horizontally and vertically, you're going to become a much, much better spey caster. And we can graft a spey cast onto that, and your forward stroke, your back cast, everything is going to be clean, because your rod is tracking straight. And as I say, the thing is, if you start with spey casts, you're curving all over the place, and there's a tendency to keep those curves going when we're casting our D-loop, when we're making our forward stroke, and we're curving and arcing in two planes, and it doesn't work. So, and I say, the quickest solution to that is to learn to false cast overhead. Now, if you're going to do that with a two-hander and you've got spey lines, keep in mind spey lines are quite a bit heavier than overhead lines for the same rod. And there's a simple reason for that. When we make a D-loop, it's only the mass of the line in the top of the D-loop that's really working to load the rod. The line that's sitting in the bottom of the D-loop that's not moving is not loading the rod. All right? It only starts to contribute to the load when it gets picked up by the rollout of the forward cast. So when we start our D-loop, we've got a bunch of lines sitting in the bottom of that D-loop that's not moving. And if it's not moving, it's not loading the rod. With an overhead cast, when you begin to make your forward stroke, you're moving the entire line. So the entire mass of the line is available to load the rod, which is the reason why spey lines are heavy and overhead lines tend to be lighter. So this is a simple formula you can use. If you want to go out and practice your overhead casting with your two-hander, use a line that's 75 to 80% of the weight of the line you'd use for spey casting. So for example, I have G Loomis NRX Plus 11-foot 8-weight switch rod, which is also to be used for my surf casting for striped bass. So I have 510 grain rage line that I use for my regular fishing. Or I can use something in the same range for a scout line or anything the same. When I put an overhead line on that rod, I went to 425. So I dropped from 510 to 425 and put an airflow 10-weight sniper, which is 425. So I dropped down in that 75 to 80% range of the total weight of the right line for my switch rod. So keep that in mind. If you want to go out and practice your overhead casting, you have to drop down in line weight because you're using the entire line to load the rod. You're not using just 70-80%, the amount of mass in the top of the D-loop. So get out in there, practice. Actually, one of the best lines to practice with is a double taper. So if you can find a double taper of the right weight, man, go for it, because they're really good for practicing overhead casting. But even so, I mean, if you're going to go with a A Spey line, just find one that drops down in weight. If you've got something like a mid-belly line, use less of it. Hang maybe 80% of the line out of the guides instead of all of the line out of the guides. So just back off and use less. But you do have to drop the weight when you are overhead casting. But nevertheless, get out there and try it. Have somebody watch you and watch your tracking. Stand behind you and see if you're tracking the rod straight. See if your rod tip is moving in a straight line. It's all you have to concentrate on is the rod tip. Don't watch anything else. Just watch your rod tip. If your rod tip is moving in a straight line, you're going to get a good cast. And if it's curving all over the place, you won't. And it's the same thing for single hand casting for trout. You want to be accurate, your rod tip has to go in a straight line. So if you're a trout fisherman and you're an accurate caster, you already know the benefits of a straight rod tip, straight line path as they call it. So if you know that already, just apply it to two-handed casting and everything's going to fall together for you. It's amazing how many things that fixes. So give it a try. Get out there, practice your overhead casting with your two-handed rod and you'll become a better Spey caster. Cheers.